Hello and welcome to this video about the Shimano ST-R8070 STI lever. It's a hydraulic lever with an electronic shifting system, and the reason for this let's jump into the content. The reason for this video is I replaced the brake hose on my bike and I had a lot of trouble in refilling the hydraulic system. So that was the reason why I then decided to strip down one of these levers and then really understand how is that lever working and what is the reason for the trouble I had. So you will see two tutorials. In the first tutorial I will walk through the basic functions of the lever. I will explain the mechanical and hydraulic parts in detail, and then you will understand how the lever itself works. And then in the second tutorial I will speak about the basic adjustments of the lever. You have two little screws, you can adjust something in the lever. I will go into detail in the second tutorial, and then of course do some troubleshooting and explain why was it that hard to refill the hydraulic system, and maybe you have a problem like that as well. And I really never found something written in the manual or video where it was explained why it was that hard to refill the system. And if you look at these two videos, you will understand what might be the reason if you have a problem like this as well. So let's jump then into the first tutorial about the basic function of the lever itself. All right. Let's focus on this lever and I will explain the basic mechanical components. As you can see right here, the whole lever, the yellow lever, moves around the main pivot. That's the black point right here. So the yellow lever here moves around the main pivot, and there's one important part I want to highlight. That's the blue part here. I call it the pusher. The pusher is really important, and you will see later on why this part is that important. We will go into detail as well in the second video, because with the adjustments you need to understand well the pusher is, what it does, and how it interacts with the other parts. Alright, so we have the lever, and if we move the lever, of course the yellow lever rotates around the main black pivot here, right here, and then the pusher is going forward, and if you then release the lever, it's going back, of course. And you can see it right here. That's the original lever. You can see the lever right here. That's the housing. This is a clamp, just it's not belonging to the lever. I had to fix it somehow. And then if I move the lever, you can see the pusher, you can see it through this little window. The pusher's going to the left. I go one step further, and then the pusher's going to the front, to the left, right here. And if I release the lever, the pusher is then, of course, going back. Right, so that's the basic mechanical stuff we need to know. And now let's jump into the hydraulic function of the lever. And first of all, let's do some vocabulary, basic hydraulic components inside. So what you see right here, everything that's in red color, that's oil inside. That's the hydraulic oil we have inside. And of course the most important thing here, that's our piston. So our piston here has a front sealing right here, and has a back sealing, of course, at the back side. It's moving into inside this cylinder, inside this channel. You have a housing sealing in the front of the piston. You can see it detailed in the next picture. Then we have a reservoir. That's where the oil is inside. And you have on top of the reservoir there's a cap. You can close the reservoir, so that's basically a closed hydraulic system, and you can close it with your 2mm key. And then of course we have this oil channel that's drilled here, and it's going all up right here. And then on the top there is the hose outlet, and inside the hose outlet there is a throttle. I will explain the functionality of the throttle later on. Of course, you have the red brake fluid, and then this area we have, oops, sorry for that, we have this area is this a little bit in a larger view, and then you can see two really important holes here. First we have the inlet port, and then we have the compensation port. And last but not least, that's the bladder. The bladder is a really important thing. I will explain later on in detail why we need a bladder inside this hydraulic, closed hydraulic system. You will understand later on. So basically the function of this lever, that's basic hydraulic functionality, is not a special thing for Shimano, something like that. Basically all hydraulic systems were more or less the same. And all right, so let's go to the next page. At the next page you can see the housing sealing once again. So of course the piston here is we need a sealing, and the sealing is here. If we look at the front side of the lever, you can see then, if you remove the piston, you can see this channel, so basically the cylinder, and then on the very front of this cylinder there is this sealing, and we have the pressure channel that's going here. And then if you look then from the back side into this cylinder, you can see, whoops, you can see this pressure channel right here. And then it's going up from here, from the pressure chamber to the top where the hose is installed later on right here. Okay, so now we bring together the mechanical components and the hydraulic components, and now we move the lever one more time, and then the lever is rotating around its main pivot. The pusher is going to the front, and it's then basically pushing the piston to the left side, because here you have a bolt inside, and then the pusher is pushing the piston to the left side. And if you release your lever, of course everything is going back. So what's going on there? So reservoir interaction. Let's have a close look at this. So as you can see, this is the original piston we can see right here with the front and the back sealing. And then if you look on top here into the cap, so the cap originally is directly above here. So the picture is a little bit, the simulation is a little bit different. So if you look on top here, you can see the inlet port and the compensation port. And as you can see right here, we have there's not one hole for one inlet port, but we have 3 little holes. So let's focus on that little detail first. And what's the reason? So if we move the piston, you could see that. If we move the piston, the front sealing then will close, of course, the inlet port. Otherwise it wouldn't be possible to build up hydraulic pressure. So we close the inlet port, so the piston moves to the left. And then if we compare these two different situations, so we can take 3 little holes with a diameter A, or we might take one large hole with a diameter B, and if we design it in a way that the diameter B, that area with this hole with a diameter B, would be as big as all 3 areas of the little ones together, so we would have basically the same functionality of the inlet port. It would allow the same amount of fluid getting through, but the advantage, of course, of 3 little holes are, if you put them like this, then of course the distance is much more smaller, distance A compared to distance B. And then if you move the piston, of course you will immediately close the 3 little holes, or you will it will close faster compared to hole B. So that's basically the reason why you have 3 little holes, because then you have a harder interaction while you move the piston to the left. Alright, so next picture, let's focus on hydraulic system. As we learned, if the piston moves to the left, then the pressure chamber is closed, because the front sealing is closing the inlet port, and then pressure can be built up, and the pressure can then transport the compressed oil through this drilled hole inside the hose, and then of course to the opposite side, to the caliper itself. Now I would like to speak about that caliper first in order to understand what's going on in this hydraulic system. Let's jump into a little bit caliper gymnastics. So focus on the brake pads. So as you can see right here, we have the brake caliper, and then of course we have brake fluid that's coming from the hose, from the compressed fluids coming through this little hole into this pressure chamber then, and of course this pressure then is moving the brake pad now here to the right. Of course you have 2 of them. I just have one brake caliper and one brake pad here. Of course the other side, that's exactly the same. And then the brake pad, of course, it's moving to the right and it's touching the brake disc and it's braking. That's the reason why we have that stuff on board. And let's bring some pressure into the brake fluid. So what happens if we bring pressure into the brake fluid? Of course, the brake pad will move and will close the gap to the disc. And that's really important right now to understand what we see right here. So we have these sealings, and we have these square sealings, and these square sealings are necessary to push back the brake pads. So that's the force actually that brings back your brake pads. It's this square sealing. So if it would be round, it would be just it would be then pressure tight, no oil would go out there, but you wouldn't have this return force then on the brake pads. So that's the reason why we always have these square sealings at the brake pad. So one more time, I go back. This is the initial state, and then I bring some load into the fluid, some pressure into the oil, and then the brake pad is moving, and then if you release your lever and you reduce the pressure of the oil, then this square sealing, these deformed square sealing, then will push back the brake pads. So that's the reason, as I said, why your brake pads are going back. And now what you can do, you can push the pads back completely. So if you push the pads back completely, maybe because you exchange the worn brake pads and you bring some fresh brake pads in, and then you push it all back, then you have a much bigger gap, of course, between your brake pads and the disc compared to the situation where you just have this elastic pushback force of the sealing. And what happens right now is, of course, you have the same sealing movement. So if you push your lever and put some oil pressure into this, bring some oil pressure into the system, of course, first of all, you would have this sealing movement, and then after the sealing movement is done, then the sealing movement, they can't move anymore, and then basically the brake pads, they will slide through to the right. So we can see this like here, it will slide to the right, and then I call this, is the gap movement. So in general, we brought some oil into the system from the brake lever into the hose, into the caliper, and this additional oil amount that that pushed the brake pad to the right, and we had this elastic sealing movement, and we have the additional gap movement to close the gap, of course. And now if I release the lever, what happens then? Of course, all the square sealing, or the square sealing can do is push the pads back, but only that little amount of sealing movement, of course. But because in this case we had to close the gap as well, that means we had to bring additional volume into the system. So that's important to understand. So I brought the gap movement and the sealing movement, and of course if the sealing is going back, in general you need additional volume because you have to compensate this gap movement. And that's really important to understand, because if we now go back to the lever and look what's going on at the lever side, so reservoir interaction, let's push everything to the left, then you can see, wow. So I had, of course, now in the very front position, I have some sealing movement and I have some gap movement. And then if you release everything, there's still the gap movement. Okay, so the sealing is bringing the pads back, is giving you the sealing movement back, but then the piston would be still in the front because there was that gap movement and this additional volume of oil you needed to push the brake pads through. But then you may ask yourself, what is the force that brings back the piston in general? The piston in general it can't be only the brake pad sealing, because the brake pad sealing, all the brake pad sealing can give you back. That's the sealing movement, but the additional oil, how is that compensated? So let's focus on that topic. That's really important to understand, and the answer for that is really easy. That's the return spring. So inside this lever, so this is the original return spring, you have two of these springs inside your lever, and these return springs actually, they put force onto the piston, and as soon as you release the lever, these springs, they will bring back the piston to its end position immediately. That's really important to understand. So that's not the brake pads itself that is pushing back the lever or the piston or something like that. It's always the return spring. So this will generate, bring some load on the piston and bring back the piston immediately. So as you can see, there's additional bolt where we have these spring here, and then the counter, so the other side of the spring is actually held by this hold, and if you put tension on the spring, then you can fix this bolt inside here. I can show it one more time, and that's the one side of the spring. This is the pivot of the spring, and the other side of the spring is then pressing against this piston. So we can simulate this, so it's basically going like this, and this will push back your piston. We can do it one more time. So that's the very front position, and then of course, as I said, this side of the spring is fixed to this bolt, and then if I do not push the lever anymore, the spring will then bring back the lever and it will push back the piston to the end position. So that's how it basically works. And now it's really important to understand what is the bladder. The bladder, that's the blue part inside here. And here you can see the original photo of this bladder. This is made out of elastic material, as you can see right here. And if it's basically like a rubber balloon, and this is close to the outside, so nothing can go outside. But in the middle of this bladder, this is open to atmosphere, and the bladder can basically go up like a balloon, and it is supposed to give additional volume to the hydraulic system. We will see it in a second how that works. So now the question is, if this spring is pushing back the piston to its end position, of course that would basically generate a vacuum inside the pressure chamber, but that's not good in a hydraulic brake system. If you have a vacuum or some bubbles, you would have some bubbles inside here. So that means it's really necessary to fill up this volume immediately, and this is really easy to understand how it works. So in the beginning it's hard to understand, but what basically happens, due to the fact that both of these holes are still closed, so the inlet port is closed and the compensation port is closed, so because the front sealing is really way above the inlet port, what actually happens is, if this spring is pushing back the piston, the oil will flow from this side through the big hole, that's the compensation port, and it's easy to go through this big hole for the oil, and the oil flow actually will be through the compensation port right here. You can see it right here, through the compensation port, and then over the sealing from the back side to the front, and will give additional oil into that volume, and you will have higher pressure here, lower pressure here as it travels back, and then the oil flows over this sealing to the front side. So if you look at this sealing, you can see it's designed in the way, of course, if the piston moves to the left, you can put up pressure, and it's tight, it will put up pressure. But the other way around, if you have an oil flow from the back side to the front, it will allow to travel over the sealing into that area right here. And if you compare this to a car brake system, you can, at a car brake system, you can even see there are special holes that will open at the inner side of the sealing to allow easy travel to the front. And now the magic bladder. What is the job of the bladder? So if the oil goes then from this area right here, as you can see, we have a constant volume here. It's a constant volume, even if the piston is moving back, we still have a constant volume here, but it has to spend oil. Oil has to travel from the back to the front, and we don't want something like a vacuum inside here as well. But if you have a constant volume and you want to spend some oil, somebody has to give you additional volume, and that's the job of the bladder. So as you can see, inside the blue bladder, it's open to atmosphere, but the bladder is, of course, it's a double balloon. There's no opening of reservoir to atmosphere, but inside the bladder can go up and can spend additional volume. So as the piston moves to the back, the oil flow will be from the back to the front, and the additional volume you need will be given by the bladder. As you can see, the bladder is going up and will spend some oil. And then after the piston is going back to its end position, then basically the brake pads are going back, and the sealing, the square sealing of the brake pads will push the brake pads back, and that oil volume is then going back through this channel in through this inlet port. And then what actually happens is, you can see it like here. Oh, sorry, that was one too far. And then the oil is going back into the reservoir. So basically, it's like first you spend the oil into the system, and then in the end the brake pads are coming back and giving oil back into the reservoir. And the reason for it is, if you have a close look here, this is the throttle we have inside. So you always want pressure in your brake system, and that's the reason why you have a throttle inside here. And then there's always pressure inside your hoses. So that's basically how it works. And if we look at that scenario one more time, so what we have, if we push everything to the front, we have this sealing movement and the gap movement, and if we start at that specific point, then first of all the lever is pushed back, and as I explained, the oil is giving into the system, so we will have an oil flow from the back side, and then we will spend extra oil into the system, and the bladder is going up, because the bladder then has to spend the volume that is needed into the system. And then at the end, so the pads will be pushed back because you have these square sealings, and the sealing movement will then push back the oil into the reservoir. So that's basically how it works, and well, this is basically it with the lever. So now you have a quite good feeling about and understanding, hopefully, about the hydraulic function of this lever, the basic function of this lever, how this all works. And now you can directly jump into the second tutorial, where I will then talk about the basic adjustments of this lever and the troubleshooting, so we can understand why sometimes it may be that hard to refill this hydraulic system again. Thanks very much for watching, and then let's jump into the next tutorial. Bye bye!